In the late 90s, the emergence of Eminem was met with both hysteria and condemnation. But behind the controversy was a desperate act of self-preservation. And today, we're not just going to look at one of the most brilliant and, let's face it, divisive artists of our time through the lens of his music. No, we're going to dissect his work as a case study in psychological survival, to understand how a man on the very brink of self-destruction basically engineered a creative system to save his own life.
You know, when the world first met Slim Shady, all it saw was pure, unfiltered chaos. The media, parents, politicians, they all looked at this spectacle of rage and just assumed he was going to burn out in a flash. But here's the thing. What looked like a chaotic, uncontrolled explosion from the outside was actually the beginning of a highly controlled, meticulously engineered system for survival. This wasn't just some artist lashing out. This was a man consciously building a fortress for his own mind.
Alright, so here's the game plan for this explainer. We're going to start with that very act of self-preservation. Then, we'll trace it all the way back to the chaos of Detroit. We'll define the core philosophy he built, what we're calling the Lyrical Loop. Then, we'll get into the specific systems he uses every single day to put it into action. After that, we'll see how this whole thing ultimately turned deep personal trauma into a global triumph. And finally, we'll figure out what we can learn from it all. Okay, so let's dive into the most important idea right away. For Eminem, this was never just about making music. It was about creating a safe space, which you could call a psychological container, for his most dangerous thoughts. And what's so fascinating is that this wasn't an accident. It was a conscious, strategic decision to build a structure to hold his own rage.
I mean, just think about the choice he was facing at the absolute peak of his fame. And yeah, his fury. He knew he was at a crossroads. He even said it himself. He could either end up in jail or shot, or he had to find another way. The path he chose? He weaponized his own trauma. He decided to take every single ounce of that anger, that anxiety, that pain, and funnel it into the one place in the entire universe where he had total, absolute control: the page.
And this, right here, just lays out the strategy perfectly. On one side, you've got the man, Marshall Mathers, who's dealing with some very real, very raw demons. And on the other, you've got the invention, Slim Shady. See, Slim Shady wasn't just a rap name. He was a purpose-built psychological container. He was a character created specifically to house the most violent, destructive thoughts, allowing them to exist and be processed safely inside of art, which kept them from spilling over and causing real harm in the real world.
So, that begs the question, right? Where does this profound, almost desperate need to build such an elaborate system of control even come from? Well, to answer that, we have to go back to the beginning, to an environment that was defined by the complete and total absence of control. And that takes us right into our next section. We're going to look at how the unforgiving landscape of his youth actually forged the very compulsion that would later define both his genius and his survival. His childhood was, a masterclass in instability. There was just no external structure, nothing to rely on. He was constantly moving between Missouri and Detroit, which meant no roots, no sense of home. There was extreme poverty, creating this daily, grinding stress. He was bullied, intensely, for being the new white kid in predominantly black neighborhoods. And on top of all that, school was completely failing him. So when your entire world is that unpredictable and hostile, you start desperately searching for something, anything, you can hold on to. In this timeline, it just shows you that path directly. The trauma of the early 80s led him to discover hip-hop, not just as music, but as an intellectual framework. It was a world that had rules, patterns, a complex structure that was totally missing from his own life. This wasn't about getting famous, this was a lifeline. He realized that if he couldn't control his environment, he could get absolute, almost godlike control over syllables, rhythm, and vocabulary. And so he began obsessively mastering the craft.
Now you see, this obsessive need for control wasn't just some habit. Over time, it actually evolved into a core philosophy. This next section is where we define the very engine of his creative process, the lyrical loop. This is where he learns to systematically turn all that chaos into pure order.
Okay, so it's really important that we get what this term means. The lyrical loop isn't a neurotic trait. It's a healthy, structured defense mechanism. It's basically a form of self-administered therapy. It's the conscious act of taking raw, messy, disordered emotion, the rage, the fear, the pain, and forcing it into the most complex, rigid, and ordered structure you can imagine. These intricate multisyllabic rhyme schemes. It's literally turning pure chaos into pure architecture.
And here's how that cycle works, step by step. It starts with him experiencing that emotional chaos, but instead of letting it just fester inside, he immediately externalizes it, getting all those raw feelings down on paper as lyrical fragments. Now, step 3. This is the magic part. He imposes a brutal, technical order, forcing those raw fragments to fit into an incredibly difficult lyrical puzzle that he sets for himself. And the result? Step 4. He achieves intellectual control over the emotional problem. The feeling is no longer some overwhelming force, it's a solved equation.
This just reframes everything, doesn't it? When you understand the lyrical loop, you realize his most controversial lyrics weren't meant to be manifestos, they were pressure release valves. They were the necessary cognitive dumps that allowed him to process his demons on paper, a vital psychological release that in his mind kept him from acting on those impulses in the real world.
So, what does this philosophy actually look like day to day? In this next section, we're going to move from the abstract theory to the concrete, obsessive habits that really bring the lyrical loop to life. This is the proof that the system works.
Okay, so his primary habit is something we could call the continuous idea archiving system. He is a meticulous, almost fanatical archivist of his own thoughts. He carries notebooks and scraps of paper with him everywhere, constantly jotting down fragmented ideas, punchlines, and complex rhyme patterns. He's not trying to write a full song in that moment. He's stockpiling lyrical ammo, and he insists on physical paper for a really fascinating reason. He develops a spatial memory of where ideas are on the page, turning his chaotic notes into a physical map of his own mind.
So once he's got all this ammo and he's ready to build a song, he deploys his second habit, the Technical Constraint System. This is where he intentionally sets an extreme lyrical challenge for himself. Like he might decide that every single line has to have a certain number of syllables or follow some bizarrely complex internal rhyme scheme. He is deliberately making the job harder for himself. But why?
And this right here is the therapeutic core of the whole system. The reason he makes it harder is because forcing his raw emotions to fit inside these rigid, technical boxes completely transforms the problem. An overwhelming feeling of rage becomes a rational, solvable, intellectual puzzle. It consumes all of his mental bandwidth, leaving no room for destructive impulses. He's basically diverting all that chaotic energy into a relentless, all-consuming pursuit of technical mastery.
This system didn't just make him a star, it built a truly resilient mind. In this section, we're looking at the long-term impact of this philosophy, how it got tested by his greatest personal battle, and the profound legacy it ended up creating.
The ultimate test of the lyrical loop came during his absolute darkest period, a severe addiction to prescription drugs that nearly killed him. His sobriety, which he finally achieved in 2008, is the ultimate proof of concept for his system. It showed that the underlying routine he had built for decades was strong enough to be repurposed. He simply swapped a destructive compulsion for a constructive one.
And this chart just shows that transfer of energy perfectly. He took the exact same obsessive-compulsive drive that was fueling his addiction and deliberately rechanneled it into his recovery and his art. For example, he started running obsessively, applying the same rigorous, structured discipline to his physical health that he applied to his rhymes. The core engine, that deep-seated need for order and control, it stayed the same. He just changed what it was powered.
And what's truly incredible is how his personal war ultimately became a public service. By putting his own brutal struggles with addiction, depression, and trauma right at the center of his art, he normalized the raw, unfiltered discussion of mental health in mainstream culture in a way no one had before. He gave millions of people a vocabulary and a voice for their own private battles.
Which brings us to our final section. We've analyzed his story, so now let's turn the lens back on ourselves. How can we apply this powerful lesson to our own lives?
So I really want you to sit with this question for a moment. What is your lyrical loop? What is the demanding, structured, systematic practice in your life that can take your own internal chaos, your anxiety, your stress, your frustrations, and channel it into something focused, ordered, and productive? It doesn't have to be music. It could be the pure logic of coding, the precision of graphic design, the physical discipline of exercise, or even the exact chemistry of cooking. The specific tool doesn't matter. The system, the conscious act of imposing order on your chaos, that's everything.
Because in the end, the most profound lesson from Eminem's journey is that the path to resilience is really paved with discipline. When you strip it all down, he was a meticulous, tormented archivist of his own pain, and his greatest weapon was the systematic control he built to manage it. His lyrical loop was both his artistic genius and his therapy. So the goal isn't to eliminate your obsessive energy, but to harness it. To find that one constructive thing that demands your complete focus, and then build a system around it. Because your ultimate masterpiece isn't the thing you create, it's your own resilience.